My wife and I have started a new phase in Campo Largo, Paraná. We both recently completed our master's degrees. I got a job as a teacher, while my wife secured a position at a local hospital. After accumulating thousands of reais in student debt, it finally seemed that all our effort had paid off. However, student debt was a separate horror story, which we'll leave for another day. In the last few months of summer, we began the move from our old home in Rio Grande do Sul to Paraná. We had already sent most of our belongings to the new house, except for one load that we were transporting on our own. We rented a moving truck and decided to make the trip in the middle of the night. Since I wasn't the most confident driver in a truck, we thought it would be ideal because of the lighter traffic. For the most part, our plan proved to be the right one, as the traffic was calm for the first few hours of the journey. However, with about 2 hours left on the trip, I ended up running over something in the road, causing the tire to go flat instantly. It was clear that it wasn't just a nail. It looked like the tire had been completely destroyed. I managed to pull over safely, as there was hardly any traffic where we were. At that point, my wife and I discussed what to do. We didn't know whether to call the truck rental company, the insurance company, or someone else first. We consulted the leaflet the rental company employee had given us and found an emergency number specifically for traffic situations. Considering our situation an emergency, we called the number. After some signal problems with the cell phone, we finally got someone to come and help us change the tire. However, this would take some time. We were annoyed by the situation, but decided to wait a bit while we watched YouTube videos on our phones. Looking back, we should have alerted the authorities about the accident, but we made a mistake by not doing so. Minutes after ending the call with the rental company, my wife nudged me and said there was someone behind the truck. I looked in the mirror and indeed, with the truck's red lights reflecting off her black sweatshirt, there was a person. I kept my eyes on him for a moment, making sure he didn't move again. I don't know why I didn't immediately call the police, but, being understanding and empathetic, my mind didn't immediately turn to the police. As I watched through the mirror, my wife nudged me again, this time with nervousness and fear in her voice. She said, "My God, look!" I looked up from the mirror and there was another person in front of the truck. I looked around and there were no other cars. These people seemed to have emerged from the trees beside the deserted road in a matter of seconds. 2 other people also appeared from behind the truck, a young woman and a man, both in their 20s. The woman gestured for me to lower the window, and I opened it a little so I could hear her. In a soft, friendly voice, she said, "Hello, we've noticed that you're having a problem. Not the good kind of problem, but still, would you like us to change the tire? We're all pretty handy with cars, aren't we, guys?" I looked at my wife and realized that she had sent a text message to the policeman, something I didn't even know was possible. I looked back at the girl outside and thanked her, saying, "Thank you, ma'am, that's very kind of you, but the rental company will be here soon and they'll fix it for us." The woman, who never stopped smiling, looked around for a moment and then replied, "Sorry, sir, it's cold out here. Do you think maybe we could go into the back of the truck while you fix it?" At this point, a guy appeared, and I was completely confused. In normal situations, I would be the person helping these young people, giving them a lift, food, or whatever they needed. I believe that although there are bad people in the world, most are inherently good. However, the situation seemed suspicious. The woman kept smiling, but the man behind her was large and robust. Surprisingly, he neither smiled nor blinked. I felt as if the person in front of the truck was still there, and the person behind the truck was now out of sight. I tried to keep this information in mind, although getting out and running wasn't an option either, because inside the back of the truck was not only furniture, but all our antiques, valuables, family heirlooms, and our personal information. It wasn't something I wanted to leave behind. At this point, I was just hoping that they would go away, that the messages to the police would work faster, or that the truck rental company would show up soon. However, none of this seemed to be happening. I answered her question with sadness in my voice. "Sorry, ma'am, We'll just wait here. There's a rest stop a few miles in that direction. You can go there to get something to eat and warm up." The empathetic side of me considered neutralizing them with kindness, so I dropped a 50 Brazilian reals note through the crack in the window. The money fell to the ground, but neither of them moved. It was then that I knew we were in trouble. The person in front of the truck started to approach the side where the other two were standing, and the man started to try and fiercely open my door. At that moment, the other man tried to open my wife's door. It was a total panic. I tried dialing the police again while talking to the attendant, and the lights of a police car that my wife had alerted me to started appearing on the horizon. The policeman got out of the car and shouted something to the group of people around the truck. The woman looked at the policeman, but didn't move away from the truck and shouted, "Hey, policeman, they've stolen our truck. Please help us." Through the mirror, I saw the policeman talking on the radio, and within a few minutes, several other policemen appeared on the horizon. It was the first relief I'd felt since this nightmare began. When the police arrived, I told them everything that had happened in a matter of minutes. The assistance truck soon arrived and fixed the tire. Finally, we were on our way. The saddest thing was to discover that it had all definitely been a trap. The police informed me that they had found a thin strip covered in dozens of nails, something I hadn't noticed and ended up running over. This strip of nails was intentionally placed there to rob or harm any unexpected victims passing by on that desolate road in the middle of the night. I didn't pursue it legally, although perhaps I should have. Some people are simply unlucky and make terrible mistakes. I just hope that these young people find their way in life and don't get the chance to hurt anyone else. I'm curious to know what people think about this story. I ended up getting into a lot of legal trouble for something I didn't even do. At the time, I was only 19, and as this story unfolded, I was young and inexperienced. I moved out immediately and rented a small place, little more than a tent. We had only been dating for a few months, and we weren't compatible. We fought constantly. As I said, I was young and thought I knew what I was doing by deciding to move in with her. It was a form of rebellion against my parents, who didn't like her. As soon as we moved in together, the fights started immediately. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and finding her staring at me. It was similar to the scene in the movie Paranormal Activity, when the main character stands motionless and watches her partner for hours. That's exactly what my ex-girlfriend did. It was truly frightening. I woke up 2 nights in a row with her standing there, watching me. When I confronted her, she just replied, "Relax, I'm just watching you." This intrigued and worried me, but I tried not to think about it too much. I didn't tell my parents either, even though I knew they were right about her. At the time, I was earning minimum wage, while she wasn't working. I couldn't pay my bills and support her, so the situation deteriorated. The fights became more frequent. I finally reached my limit after a month and told her I was moving out as soon as the month was officially over. She lost control when she heard this and started physically assaulting me, punching me in the face. I put my hands up and begged her to stop. I'm sure the neighbors heard, but in the area where we lived, nobody meddled in other people's lives. Finally, we managed to talk things over and agreed to go back to our parents' houses and take things one day at a time. I was surprised by the maturity of the conversation, considering our history of past arguments. I made my arrangements and told her I was going home the next morning. That night, I woke up to her screaming, a desperate scream that sounded like murder. She wasn't in her room, so I ran into the living room and found her by the front door. I tried to console her, but she hit me on the head with the keys, causing pain and confusion. When I tried to understand what was going on, she kept repeating, I know. I had no idea what she was talking about. I tried to calm her down, to no avail. What I didn't realize was that, before she started screaming, she had already called the police. When I reached out to comfort her, she threw herself on top of me. The police arrived and handcuffed me immediately. Without asking too many questions, they put me in the back of the police car and told me I would be taken to the detention center while they investigated the situation. I called my parents, who arrived quickly, fighting for me. Apparently, she had called the police and claimed that I had assaulted her. I had exchanged text messages with my parents about my plan to return home, which turned out to be crucial as evidence. I was held in the detention center for over a week, with no evidence or proof against me. Some have suggested that perhaps the police were involved in some way, but I can't say for sure. It was a disturbing experience. Eventually, I was released, and after years, I managed to sue everyone involved and clear my record. However, this stain on my name stayed with me for a long time. An additional detail is that I found out years later that she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a genetic condition in her family. It made me think of all the times she watched me sleep and the night she locked me up, repeating that she knew. I'm relieved that I got out of that situation when I did. I sincerely hope that she got the help she needed and can lead a happy and healthy life. In 2017, I made the decision to leave my hometown and embark on a solo journey across the country. My entire family lived in my hometown, and none of my cousins or other relatives had any interest in leaving. I wanted to be the one to break this tradition in my family. Of course, they were disappointed, as our family was very close, but I felt it was time to explore the world beyond our backyard. I moved from a big city in Sao Paulo to a relatively small town in the countryside. I was extremely excited to start a new phase of life in this little corner of the world. Before the move, I had visited the town a few months earlier and met many locals who seemed lovely. The community was friendly and everyone seemed to look out for each other. Finally, the time came to move, and my fiancé Rick and I moved in together. The move, for the most part, went smoothly, with a few arguments along the way, but in the end everything worked out. By 6 p.m., we were already inside our new home. However, our happiness with our new home was short-lived. During the night, we were woken up by a strange sound, which sounded like a door slamming. Rick got out of bed to investigate and, when he returned several minutes later, he said he hadn't found anything unusual. He explained that he might have forgotten to lock the front door due to the excitement of the day. However, something about the time it took him to check and return seemed excessive. When I questioned him about the reason for the delay, he revealed that the front door was unlocked, which was unusual for us. He spent a few minutes checking the house to make sure there were no intruders, and fortunately, he didn't find any. Whatever we had heard was gone. He reassured me, gave me a kiss and told me not to worry. We went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Something in me just wasn't right. The next morning, we had breakfast and continued decorating and organizing our new home. At around 1 p.m., we got ready to leave the house, and in front of the door was a package with a note that said, "Welcome, enjoy the house." Rick took the package and opened it, finding just an ordinary glass, with an antique appearance, but nothing special. He made a few jokes about the quirkiness of the townspeople, which made me laugh, but I also felt a certain discomfort. Something about it didn't seem right. After picking up the package, we went shopping and bought everything we needed. Moving is tiring, and sometimes you only realize what's missing when everything is already in place. That evening, we had dinner, set up the internet and watched a movie together, but I felt strange and anxious. Around midnight, we went to bed, but shortly afterwards we heard 3 loud knocks. None of us had managed to get to sleep yet, as we had only just got into bed. Rick went to check, and before he could answer, we heard the 3 loud knocks again. An elderly woman screamed desperately for help, claiming that there was an intruder outside and that she wasn't safe. Rick replied that he would call the police, but the woman insisted that we let her in, claiming that they were after her. Rick sympathetically said that he would call the police, but the woman suddenly, in a deep, sinister voice, ordered us to open the door immediately, threatening to harm us. She pointed to the door and repeated the order. The old woman ran to the door and pushed it hard. Two young, older men ran into the house and started attacking Rick, throwing him to the ground. I hid in the closet and watched the fight through the crack in the door. I held my breath and waited for the police to arrive at any moment. The attackers were kicking Rick, and I could hear him coughing and struggling. The old woman, while cheering and laughing, seemed to be in control of the situation. I don't know how much time passed, probably only a few moments, but finally the police lights appeared through the windows. The three intruders fled through the back door, as if they knew the layout of the house perfectly. The old woman picked up the package with the glass and shouted again, "Enjoy the house." She knew Rick's name, which disturbed me even more. By the time the police arrived, the intruders had escaped. Rick, bruised and shaken, provided all the information we could remember, including the package with the note. We told the police that the intruders seemed to know the house well and gave detailed descriptions, since they weren't wearing masks. The fact that we saw their faces and eyes made them even more frightening. The two men looked well dressed, young and muscular, one with blonde hair and the other with dark hair and starting to go bald. The elderly woman was frail and small, her skin seeming to slip off her body. She had white, straight hair and I couldn't see if she had any teeth, but that's the only part of the description I'm not sure about. The police didn't manage to catch the invaders, but that didn't matter so much to us. We stayed in a hotel for a few nights before returning to our city. Being alone, without family, during that nightmare almost destroyed me, and more than ever, I needed my family. To this day, we still live here, and we have no intention of moving again. The most frustrating thing is that we never got any answers as to why we were targeted by these invaders. I still haven't slept well since that nightmare, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to sleep peacefully again. The story I'm about to share is intriguing, mysterious, and still doesn't have a definitive ending. This story may keep you awake at night, but not for the usual reasons. If you're like me, you'll spend the whole night pondering it. Let me start by saying that moving is an experience that mixes excitement and apprehension. Moving to a new place and making it your home can be exciting, but the moving process itself can be challenging. I've moved at least a dozen times in my life, and I'm only 31. 2 years ago, after the end of a long-term relationship, I needed to find a new place to live. We had bought a house together, but after it ended, I left that house and lived in an apartment for a year. When the contract on the apartment ended, I decided to look for a house to rent instead of buying, for various reasons. I decided not to buy another house at that time, especially since I was finishing my degree and could move to another state after graduation. Besides, the real estate market was unstable then, just as it is now. By chance, I found an old but largely renovated house through a work colleague. She introduced me to a neighbor, whom I'll call Joe in this story, who was looking for someone to rent a house he had bought at a low price. Joe was one of those real estate investors who bought houses, did some renovations, and then rented them out. He had never lived in these houses, he just invested that way. At the moment, that's what I was looking for, and I could rent the place out on a monthly basis, which suited my lifestyle at the time. Joe and I signed all the documents, agreed on the price, and I became the proud tenant of a house on the corner of a secluded street. When I moved in, I was impressed by the house. It was much bigger than I had imagined from the photos. The house was old, but the interior was completely updated and renovated. Joe had even set up the Wi-Fi, which was included in the rent. The house was at the end of a street that had 3 other side streets. You had to leave the main street, which wasn't very busy, and turn a few times until you reached the street I was on. At the end of this street was the house I rented, hidden behind a large group of trees. I figured the privacy would be ideal for me, since I studied online and spent a lot of time working from home. The first month in the house was great. I didn't see any of my neighbors, which was perfect for my need for privacy. The house was quiet, and I spent most of the time organizing my things after the move. However, for some reason, I just didn't feel at home. I loved the isolation of the house and its advantages, but something didn't feel right. At the beginning of the second month, I organized a small gathering and showed the house to some friends. We went down to the basement and there we heard a strange noise, as if something was scratching one of the walls near the stairs. I hadn't been in the basement since the move, as the washer and dryer were in a separate room off the kitchen. That was the first time I'd heard that noise, and my friends joked about it being rats, about someone being tied to the walls, and even one of them being scared and wanting to get out of the basement. We all laughed and went upstairs to continue the meeting, but I couldn't stop thinking about that noise. Throughout the night, the noise wasn't just plumbing, it was definitely a scratching sound. Eventually, everyone left, except my friend Mike. We decided to investigate what was causing that noise in the basement. We were equipped with screwdrivers and hammers, as if we knew what we were doing. To be clear, we had no idea what we were doing, but the noise intrigued us. We went down to the basement, and there we found the source of the scratches. I pointed a flashlight into the dark hole and we soon saw it. We found at least a dozen large rats, and I'm sure there were more, but I stopped counting after 12. However, the rats were the least of our problems in that dark cave under the stairs. There were dark, almost reddish stains everywhere in the small room, which was no bigger than a bathroom. There were also chains, handcuffs, knives, and even a sickle, all very rusty, which indicated that these objects were very old. The most disturbing part for me, for some reason, was a dirty bowl in the corner of the room, containing a rusty fork and a pile of old books. I don't know what those books were, but they seemed to be those old ones, with a peculiar cover, and their pages were almost yellowed. One of the books was open, and the writing was almost completely faded. I called Joe immediately, even though it was midnight at the time. He came to the site and examined the hole for himself. He looked confused, annoyed, and embarrassed all at the same time. That same night, I moved in with my parents, and Joe didn't object, given the circumstances. He even reimbursed me for the first month's rent. Since then, I've been thinking a lot about that little room under the stairs. I still don't know what it is or what happened there. I ponder the idea of contacting Joe to find out what he's done about it, but I think that might be awkward. One of the reasons I'm writing this is to ask for advice on how I can find out more about the former owners of the house. I'm not an expert in internet research, so any guidance would be greatly appreciated. If I find out what happened in that room, I'll write a follow-up. Until then, the mystery of the dark and spooky room will be kept under the stairs. Relocating can sometimes be complex. Due to the nature of my work, I am often subject to relocations. Initially, the prospect of being able to travel all over the country was exciting, as I would have the opportunity to get to know different cultures and visit sites that I wouldn't otherwise have the chance to see. However, although I visited some truly remarkable places, not all the new locations were equally enjoyable. Last year, my company transferred me to a small town in Goiás. The location itself wasn't too bad, as my house was a small hut hidden among the trees, and the town was small, inhabited by ordinary people. The house I stayed in for the month was reasonable. Nevertheless, it wasn't one of the best places I've ever stayed. The Wi-Fi connection was poor, and I had to drive about 20 minutes to the nearest supermarket, which was in Atacado. In fact, I just wanted to be alone in my little hut and move on to the next destination. Although I had two neighbors on the east side of my house, they were separated by dense vegetation. As it was the fog season, I could see a little through the trees, but they were far enough away that I didn't make the effort to greet them. Although it sounded strange, that's how I felt. 2 nights after arriving at my new home, I went out into the yard to smoke a cigarette before going to bed. It must have been around 11 o'clock, I think, as the place was isolated. The yard was completely dark, a peculiar but sinister darkness with a strange beauty. Before entering the house, I glanced to the side and through the trees. That's when I noticed my neighbor standing there. He seemed to be staring at me. I grimaced as I tried to focus on his figure and realized that he was looking at my house, not at me. I waved, but the man didn't move. It seemed as if he hadn't even noticed me. Strange, I thought, but I was tired at the time and didn't take much notice. I went into the house and got ready for bed. I'm not sure how much time passed, but I woke up to an extremely loud noise coming from my living room. I lay still in bed for a moment, thinking that perhaps I had dreamt the noise. However, when I got up and looked through my bedroom door, I realized that something was wrong. The house was dark, with only the faint light of the moon coming through, but I could make out the figure of a man in my living room. I locked the bedroom door, but the intruder broke it down. I didn't have a weapon or anything, so I basically hid behind the door, completely paralyzed by fear. The seconds seemed endless as I listened to the sound of the intruder's approaching footsteps. I pondered the idea of running, but I wasn't confident in my ability to do so successfully. When the sound of footsteps indicated that the intruder was very close to my bedroom door, he stopped for a moment and then started moving in the opposite direction. I risked looking through the door again and saw the dark house. It was then that I heard a loud, strong voice coming from the intruder, who was actually a policeman, ordering, "Don't move. Eric, put the knife down and come here now." I was shocked, relieved, and honestly surprised. Where I come from, the police don't just walk into a house like that. He knew I was in real danger. When the policeman knocked Eric down, the loud noise I heard was the machete falling to the floor, along with the two men. I cowered behind the door, still paralyzed with fear. The policeman then shouted, "If anyone is here, get in your car now and drive a mile down the road, where another policeman is positioned." I was only in my underpants and a Mortal Kombat t-shirt, but I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, heading towards where the other policeman was. When I got there, there were two policemen and my neighbor. They checked me over to make sure I was okay and not injured. I got the full story later. About a year ago, a girl lived in the house where I was staying, and the guy Eric was her boyfriend. They were both involved in illegal activities in the house, which led to the woman's death. Eric didn't handle the situation well and began to exhibit unstable behavior, going to and from prison for petty crimes. The police believe that he committed these crimes to secure a meal and a place to sleep on cold nights. A few months ago, no one in town had seen Eric, and people began to think that perhaps he had disappeared or moved to another town. However, that night, my neighbor saw him wandering near my house. Eric had sneaked in through the unlocked kitchen window. My neighbor immediately called the police, and the officer broke down my door to protect me, as he knew I was in real danger. When the policeman knocked Eric down, the loud noise I heard was the machete falling to the floor, along with the two men. It was then that Eric's voice, which was laughing sinisterly, could be heard. After his arrest, it was learned that he was suffering from serious mental problems, and that no one in the town had seen or heard from him for months. He was referred for treatment, and the town was relieved that the threat had been contained. The next morning, I called my company, which arranged a hotel for me for a few weeks before I left town, never to return. As far as I know, Eric has been referred for care and no longer poses a threat to himself or others. I am extremely grateful to my neighbor for his quick action and to the police for their timely intervention. If I could offer one piece of advice to anyone reading this story, it would be this: don't just lock your doors. Always check your windows and keep them locked. You never know what kind of danger might be lurking outside. Before I share my story, I'd like to make it clear that I recognize my share of responsibility for what happened. My quirky sense of humor got me into trouble again, and this time people were really affected by my silly antics. If you're reading this and you know the man I'm talking about, know that I'm very sorry. A few years ago, my wife and I moved to a new house in a lovely suburb. It was the ideal place to start and raise a family, one of those picturesque suburbs you see in movies or series. I never imagined that I would live in such a nice place all my life, but I am grateful to my wife and her work. Although I also contributed, she was undeniably the queen of the castle from the start. When we were moving in, I already noticed curious looks from the neighbors. Two young men covered in tattoos drew attention, and I knew how some people reacted to that. While we were moving our things home, several neighbors came over to welcome us. These people were friendly, although somehow a bit fake. Still, it was nice, and my wife loved it. However, the couple who lived directly opposite our house were another story. They were an older couple, probably in their 70s or 80s. I saw them peeking through the shutters, and they weren't fleeting glances. They watched us as if they were taking part in a contest to see who blinked first. I waved at them sarcastically and ironically, but they didn't reciprocate. They continued to stare at us for a while longer and then closed the shutters. I turned to my wife and said, "Never mind those guys." I tried to be nice, but they're too grouchy. She laughed and asked me to be more polite to the new neighbors. About 10 minutes later, the man actually came up to me. He crossed the street and entered my garage, where I was storing some tools. He got my attention in a loud, aggressive voice, saying, "Hey, I don't appreciate what you're doing. This is a quiet neighborhood, and I'll call the police if I have to." Inside, I was laughing at the situation, but instead of trying to calm things down, my temper got a little worse. I looked at the older man, half cowering, and replied in the same tone I had been addressed with, "Listen, comrade, first get off my property. You can't just walk into my garage. Secondly, I don't know who you think you are, coming here threatening me and talking about calling the police. My wife and I are good people." Instead of saying something stupid, I provoked the older man. Instead of answering, he approached me, puffed out his thin chest and moved closer. My wife finally heard the commotion and ran through the side door, putting herself between us. I would never do anything against that old man, but he was trespassing on our property and provoking me. My wife tried to calm the situation, introduced herself and apologized for my behavior. However, instead of accepting this, the older man spat in front of her and said, "Stay away from me, lost. I don't care who you are. You're dirty and you're ruining my neighborhood." My wife stood there, staring at the man, her mouth almost on the floor. I laughed quietly, but deep down, as she pointed to his house and ordered, "Get out of here now and get off our property." The man walked away mumbling something, and we just looked at each other in complete disbelief. Nothing like this had ever happened to us before. Of course, since I can't just let little things slide, I started planning to exaggerate the situation, as I usually do. I had several boxes of Halloween decorations because we're big fans of the holiday. Every year, we decorate the house and throw a huge party. I made a joke with my wife about how I couldn't wait to see how he would react when we decorated the house for Halloween. She laughed, but asked me to stop and forget about it. Well, that wasn't going to happen. After all, she married me and should know that I always take things a bit too far. That's when I grabbed some movie-quality fake blood that we'd used on the windows the previous Halloween. It was washable, so I wasn't worried about ruining anything. I made a huge stain on the window overlooking his house. When the sun went down and I turned on the light in that room, it would look like a huge splash of blood on the window. That was my shameless attempt to play a prank on the old man across the street. I could never have imagined how he would react. I didn't want any kind of confrontation. I just wanted him to get angry and maybe leave me a letter in the mailbox or something. That night, my wife and I were watching a movie when we heard someone trying to open our front door. Alarmed, we jumped up from the sofa and ran to the door. Just as we reached the door, the guy broke it down with an axe. I immediately started shouting at him, who began to approach me with the axe raised. I'm big, but I'm not going to be able to stop a guy who's about to hit me with an axe. I tried to reason with him, saying, "Calm down, buddy, what's going on?" He was beside himself, raging and stumbling over his words. I saw the blood, and I knew he was trouble. He just kept repeating that phrase. I saw the blood over and over again. Despite the panic I was beginning to feel, I replied as quickly as I could, "It's fake. I'm sorry. I was just playing a joke." The axe was still above his head, a little less aggressively now, but he was still shouting, "Death is no joke." While all this was going on, my wife ran upstairs to call the police. It was scary, but I knew I could outrun the guy and overpower him if I could get him to drop the axe. While I was trying to come up with a plan to get out of this situation, he put the axe down and fell to his knees. He was motionless and seemed to be almost out of breath, with his hands still raised in a defensive position. I approached him and said, "Hey, buddy, you're okay. Let's take a step back." At that moment, the man simply collapsed in my living room. I shouted for my wife, who was much better in these situations than I was. She ran down the stairs, and I'll never forget the pain in her eyes at that moment. She shouted, "I think he's dead," and just a few minutes later the police arrived. I told them to go in immediately, and an ambulance arrived minutes later. It looked like he wasn't dead yet, but he ended up passing away a few days later in hospital due to a cardiac arrest or something. It was tragic, and I felt horrible about the situation. I went to his wife and apologized personally for any damage or pain I may have caused. That poor woman couldn't have been kinder to me. She smiled and said that he was very old and very ill and no longer had all his mental faculties. "You young people haven't done anything wrong," she said. That didn't make me feel any better. After that night, I tried to be friendlier and less arrogant. I looked after the upkeep of the woman's house until she passed away just a few weeks ago. That motivated me to sit down and write all this. So I urge you all to be careful who you tease. No one has any idea what's going on in people's minds or what emotional state they're in. I went through the horror of having my life threatened, and then the horror of a man dying right in front of me in a matter of seconds. Life is short, and I ask all of you to simply be good people.